Joining me for the third and final time over the course of this live stream is Colonel Andrew Field, MBE, author of Wellington's Waterloo Allies. Andrew, I've been saying this a lot, but welcome back. It's good to see you again. With the Prince of Orange, he has this very infamous reputation, I think it's fair to say. Is this sort of the long shadow that's been cast over him as the symbol of incompetence in Bernard Cornwell's Sharpe's Waterloo?
Well, I certainly don't think that Bernard Cornwell did him any favours in his novels. But to be fair to Bernard Cornwell, the Prince of Orange did have a pretty poor reputation, certainly amongst the senior British officers by the time of Waterloo. Many of them will have known him from the Peninsula. But before Wellington came to take over command of the army in May, he had been the senior commander of the army. And there were many complaints from formation commanders and from other British officers about the way that he tried to prepare the British army for the coming campaign, over-drilling them, over-exercising them, and sort of generally messing them around. And of course, he had working for him British senior officers were much older than him, far more senior than him, except by the fact that he had recently been made a full general in the British Army, and of course far more experience than he had. So I suspect there was a touch of jealousy, if I'm perfectly honest, but I wonder how a 22-year-old with his limited operational experience and his limited command, how he sat as a senior commander there and how he handled those senior officers. He was put in a very difficult position, but I don't think he executed it very well, and I don't think it helped when Wellington was finally nominated to take command, that he wrote to Wellington saying, "You're the only officer that I would happily hand over to," thereby passing over all these very experienced other British generals. So I think there was a certain arrogance about him as well. So he started off on the wrong foot, I suspect, in the campaign. And then, of course, the performance of Quatre Bras, although the Netherlands fought pretty well and the battle fought pretty well, there were errors in his performance there. And of course, most famously, Quatre Bras responsible for forming the 69th, 2nd Battalion, the 69th British Regiment into line when they were forming square, because he said there was no cavalry threat, and then they were ridden down, had huge casualties, and lost to colour. Obviously, that wasn't going to do his reputation any good either. But I think for me, the biggest mistake he probably made is very little commented on. And that is, on receiving the news of the French crossing of the border on the 15th of June, the Prince, whose troops were in the forward line, decided it should be him that rides to Brussels to inform the Duke of Wellington. So he left his corps at the sort of moment that they were expecting to come into contact with the French, left them to ride up to Brussels, and then, having delivered the news, chose to stay there for the Duchess of Richmond's ball, and then overnight in Brussels, whilst those really key decisions on the deployment of troops to Quatre Bras, for example, were having to be made by his quartermaster general, Constant Lebec, and the divisional commander down there, Panchet, to make that key decision to occupy Quatre Bras, a decision really he, as a corps commander, should have made. So not a very auspicious start.
It's not, although perhaps the irony is that because the Prince of Orange wasn't making those decisions, maybe that actually helps the long-term outcome of the campaign. I guess it's one of those things we'll never know. You alluded to this. He's served on Wellington's staff, hasn't he, prior to Waterloo? Just give us a sense of this background. And equally, this decision to ride off and tell Wellington in person, do you think that's perhaps influenced by that history of that connection that he's got with Wellington?
I think that last point, I think that's absolutely a good point. I think he wanted to go and deliver that news personally to Wellington, but he should have known well enough that that was not his job. So he was commissioned into the Prussian army when he was 16. He was then commissioned into the British army in 1811 as a full colonel, not bad going. at that age. And the same year, he went out to Spain to get some operational experience. Now, when he arrived there, Wellington was keen for him to work in a brigade, perhaps as a deputy brigade commander underneath an experienced British brigade commander, to learn the business, to learn commanding troops, because of course up until then he had no experience commanding troops at any level. Whereas any one of those officers, that brigadier that he was working for, the brigade commander he was working for, would have commanded troops as a second lieutenant, as a captain, and as a major, and as lieutenant colonel, having commanded a battalion. That's what Wellington wanted for him, but he said he didn't want to do this. He chose not to do this. He chose to become an aide-de-camp to Wellington, a far more prestigious appointment, a far more comfortable existence, I'm quite sure, but meant he didn't get that level of tactical experience that he really needed that would fit him for higher command. He was present of a number of major actions, major battles through the peninsula, and showed incredible courage at them. But at the end of the day, when he came to leave Spain a couple of years later, so at the end of 1813, when the Netherlands on the point of being liberated from the French, and he left with only that experience of operating in Wellington's headquarters, and without that tactical level of experience that was to be exposed during the Waterloo campaign.
During the Battle of Waterloo, it's always struck me that his corps is essentially split across both wings of the Allied position. And I've always queried whether or not this is a deliberate move by Wellington to reduce the Prince of Orange's ability to make a decision that could have disastrous consequences, because it's just that much harder to be everywhere at once and have that sort of overall picture on what's happening on both sides of the field. Do you think that's fair, or is that sort of a slightly cynical take on the situation?
That's quite a cynical take on the situation. However, Jay, I tend to agree with you. That's my theory, but unfortunately, there's no real evidence to prove that. Clearly, he hadn't performed particularly well at Quatre Bras as an individual. He'd had a couple of mistakes that we'd already touched upon, and I think Wellington was a bit concerned that one of his two frontline corps commanders was an inexperienced young chap, and so I think that was behind Wellington's decision to split his corps across the whole of the British line. The extreme right was held by one of his divisions, the extreme left was held by another one of his divisions. Another division was split into half. The cavalry was put under command of the Duke of Uxbridge. And that was only decided on the morning of the battle. That was a real risk by Wellington to break up a corps, reorganize the command, the chain of command, in order to cover those troops and incorporate them into other commands. That's a real risk and threatened people understanding of the correct chain of command. And he was nominated as a commander of the centre. But who did that consist of? I don't know. I can find no evidence for who was therefore put under his command in the centre. And he rushed around, made some really poor decisions, rushed around, led some brave counterattacks, but he did all that generally under the eye of Wellington, which is perhaps why he ended up in the centre. Although that didn't save some other units from a rather grisly end. So it's a really difficult question to prove, but I'm pretty sure that that was behind Wellington's decision.
You mentioned that certain units suffer quite badly from some of Orange's decisions. We've talked about Quatre Bras already, but I want to talk about Ompteda and the whole debacle there. Can you just give us a quick sense of what happens and who's at fault here?
That, of course, La Haye Saint sat in front of the centre of the Allied army, and so the Prince was no doubt in a position looking down on that and seeing how the attacks on that farm were developing. Quite early on, when the French were almost investing it and attacking it, he ordered through one of his aides-de-camps for the Lunenburg battalion, a regular Hanoverian battalion, to counterattack and support the garrison. They marched down in line. initial success, but then they were ridden down by a force of cuirassiers. By the time they got back onto the ridge, there were only about 50 troops that could be mustered, and they were sent back to pick up any stragglers they could find. So there was a battalion straight out of battle. Then later, in a very similar situation, the order came to Antida to counterattack onto La Haye-Saint with 2 of his battalions, the 5th and 8th Line battalions of the King's German Legion. Antida, as a brigade commander, that wasn't the whole of his brigade, that was only half of his brigade, sent them down. And once again, that same force of cuirassiers suddenly appeared from a piece of dead ground and rode down part of the 8th battalion, captured one of their colours, and again sabred a fair proportion of the troops. The 5th battalion, luckily, because the 8th battalion were in the line of the charge, were able to form square and withdraw with very few casualties. But the 8th were pretty much ridden down too. And then later in the battle, General Van Alten ordered the 5th battalion, again 5th Line battalion, to counterattack and try and recapture La Haye-Saint once it had been captured by the French. Now, Antida, after his previous experiences, argued with the order and refused to do that, and said those cavalry are still down there and we're going to face the same problem as found out. Van Alten insisted, Antida refused, and the Prince of Orange arrived, and then, perhaps not surprisingly and possibly correctly, supported the senior commander and ordered Antida to send the 5th battalion down. Antida, feeling his honour was now at stake, decided as a brigade commander that he should lead the 5th battalion down to La Haye-Saint. Surprise, surprise, exactly the same thing happened. The battalion was ridden down and Colonel Antida lost his life, was killed by the French cavalry, and the attack failed. So there are 3 situations where, from our understanding, those were orders from the Prince of Orange to carry out those attacks, and if you like, 3 battalions were decimated as a result of that.
If I understand rightly, according to some sources, Taylor actually had his son with him at the battle, didn't he? And
I think they were his nephews.
Okay.
And he made sure that they were put into a position of safety before he led the 5th battalion down, so that so he clearly saw what was coming and wanted to make sure that they were in a position of safety before he left. But yes, they could well have suffered the same fate if he hadn't have taken that care.
Absolutely. So when you put all of this together, how do you sum up the Prince of Orange's role at Waterloo? I mean, it's worth saying, look, he's wounded at Waterloo, not hugely seriously, but a little. Was he more of a hindrance than a help, or is that too harsh?
Yeah, difficult one. I think it's fair to say, once again, he displayed much courage. He led counterattacks in the centre by the Nassauers, by some of the Hanoverian units. And he was he was seen as an inspirational leader by the Netherlands troops. He was, after all, their prince. So he had quite a lot of respect, and he clearly had a lot of courage as well. But as we've already discussed, as a corps commander, there were sufficient doubts over his ability to command the corps for Wellington to make the decision not to leave him in that command for the battle. And of course, as we've just discussed, on 3 separate occasions, he displayed very poor tactical decision-making that resulted in many deaths, and probably reflected the fact that he had actually no tactical experience or no experience commanding troops on the battlefield, and therefore perhaps this was just an accident waiting to happen. So overall, I think I would sum it up by saying that whether you say he was a help or a hindrance, I don't think he had a significant impact on the battle and on the victory.
Andrew, you've been very generous with your time over the course of today. Colonel Andrew Field, MBE, author of Wellington's Waterloo Allies. Thank you for joining us here on Waterloo Live.
A pleasure. Thanks very much, Zach.